Hi, I'm Lark G, and I was born in 1965, which might seem a long time ago, but to me it really isn't. May 11th, and I am the oldest of 7 children. I was born in Provo. My father was going to BYU to get his undergrad degree, and my mother was working at different jobs and then became a stay-at-home mom. We lived in a trailer when I was first born. My next sister that came a year later in early July, her name is Emily. And then I have 2 brothers after that, Stephen and Paul. And we were all very, very close together. And then when I was almost 5, my mother found out that she was pregnant. And this was not just a regular pregnancy. This was triplets. And she didn't find out really until she was 7 months along, because she didn't go to the doctor for a while. She felt like, hey, I've got this down. And then when she did go, she said, I think there's twins here. And the doctor kind of poo-pooed her and said, I know more than you do. But he did order an x-ray, which at the time, which is about 47 years ago, was not common. They did find out that she was pregnant with triplets and later found out that they were identical. After they were born, they were able to find this out. And so the doctor immediately put her on 2 months bed rest. She went full term. She had 19 pounds of baby. They were all well and healthy. And I can remember one of my earliest childhood memories is on Christmas Day going to the hospital with my father and my 3 other siblings to pick up my mom and the triplets, because they had been born on December 22nd, healthy and strong, and 3 days later they were able to go home. And the nurses had sewn some really cute stockings that they put in, and we took them home on Christmas Day. And as they grew, I would put them in my little red flyer wagon, and pull them around the neighborhood. And people just thought that it was so novel. And for me, I couldn't understand why they were getting so excited about these 3 little girls in their pink snowsuits, all matching, because it was just normal. And I thought everybody had a set at home of identical triplet girls. I moved around a lot when I was younger. Specifically, I went to a different school every year of my life. And as I look back, there were pros and cons with that. I never understood my father until much later in life, as I began to understand myself. And I realized that he had itchy feet, that he got bored very easily, and he needed a lot of stimulus to continue to find adventure in life. And so even though we did move around a lot, I felt like my life was full of adventure and fun and lots of different activities. I lived in multiple states and multiple cities within those states. And for the most part, I really had a good time with that. It helped me to be very outgoing. I had to make friends very quickly. I'm able to talk with most people and to connect with them. I think that's a gift that I have learned over time, just having been put in those situations. So as I mentioned before, I was born in Provo, lived in Utah for the first 5 years of my life. And then, as I mentioned, when the triplets were born, when they were 10 months old, we got in a large red camper that my father had built, and we went on an adventure. We moved out of Utah, and we moved back to Tennessee, to Mount Pleasant, Tennessee, which is a very, very small city. Now, this was huge because back in 1971, that was not usual that you go across country like that. And so as I look back, I realize how isolated my mother must have felt, because, we didn't make phone calls often. There were letters, but otherwise she was kind of on her own. We were in a very small branch. The branch consisted of 45 people, 9 of which were my family, keeping in mind that me as the oldest, I just had turned 6. And so 6 on down to the triplets, my mom, and at that point my dad had pretty much stopped going to church. He just felt like religion wasn't for him, even though he had served in Toronto Mission, and even though they had been married in the temple, actually by President Monson, who was his mission president. He just started to become inactive. So I spent my first grade in Mount Pleasant, and as I mentioned, it was a very small town. We lived in a small home, and just tried to meet people. I can remember that I had a very adventurous spirit, and something that just plagued my mother is that I would disappear often. I felt like I needed to go wander off and go find this places that I wanted to investigate. I can actually remember one time planning an activity as a 6-year-old to go several miles away and simply check out this abandoned building that I had seen as we had driven by. Now, it didn't happen. Fortunately, I decided against it because I realized that, you know, a 10-minute drive in a vehicle is probably a lot longer than a 6-year-old should be allowed to walk back then. But my mom just kind of had to roll with things because I was constantly disappearing, and she was having these small children and couldn't quite keep up with them. So that was my early life, adventurous, always moving. After we lived in Tennessee for several years, I spent ages 6 through 12 there, moving around. I did spend 6 months in Arizona with my father and my 2 brothers when my parents kind of separated for a little bit of time, but then came back to Tennessee. We lived in Virginia in a place called Warm Springs, which is outside Covington, Virginia, also nicknamed Stinky City because of the paper mill that was there. Spent some time there, 7th grade, and then we moved back to Utah as a 14-year-old, and that was great. Oh, I also forgot to mention we lived in Southern California when I was 12 years old because my mother separated from my father, took all the kids down there, and lived next door to her parents, my grandma and grandpa Campbell. So moved back to Utah, lived in different places in Utah, and that was really nice in many ways because I felt that I was coming home. We could see our grandparents, we could see cousins, aunt and uncles, and I had really missed that. I had a favorite aunt, Aunt Debbie, from my childhood, and I got to see her as well. But something that was disconcerting was to be around a lot of LDS members who were not as active as I felt they should be. Having grown out in the mission field for the most part, it was very interesting to see the LDS members in the mission field were more, you either are active or you're not active. It wasn't one of these things where you were active just because you wanted to put on a face or a certain show for people. So that was a little bit disconcerting for me to see boys who had been out drinking and swearing on a Saturday night. They were then sitting at the sacrament table blessing the sacrament. And that whole, it just didn't seem right to me that it was people were not following their faith like I felt they should be. If they weren't, then they could leave, but they chose to stay just for the, you know, the social aspect of it. When I was 15 years old, a friend of mine introduced me to the idea of becoming an international exchange student. Now, at the time, this was very forward-thinking. People did not travel out of the country very much at all, let alone allow their children to go overseas for a year to a strange country, strange family, etc., etc. But I just took hold of that idea and decided that that was what I was going to do. Now, the interesting aspect is that at that time, my parents had divorced. My mom was a single mother of 7. She was working full-time, trying to make ends meet, and economically, we really did not have the resources for me to do something so fantastic like this. I had no idea what program I was going to get involved with. This wasn't like today's age where you could Google things. Did not have any idea where I was going, what I was going to do, etc. However, I just had a burning feeling that I needed to do this. And so I was prompted to buy this picture, this poster of Austria, because I knew I wanted to go to Europe, and I put it up, and every night as I would fall asleep, I would look at this beautiful village and these mountains, and I would say, I'm going there next school year. And I would just get this feeling inside me that I was going to Europe next year. Well, over the course of the next couple months, I was listening to the radio, as 10th graders are wont to do, and I heard that American Scandinavia Student Exchange was looking for students, Americans, who wanted to come over to Scandinavia to study for a year. And I thought, well, that's me. And that Scandinavia is comprised of Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Finland. And I thought to myself, well, I've heard some really negative things about Sweden as far as being a very liberal country. And so even though I'd want to go there, I don't think my mother will let me. So I went to my mom and I said, hey, I'd like to go on exchange. I think it's going to be Denmark. And she said, oh, you should go to Sweden because that's where your dad's mother, her parents are from Sweden. And I said, great, I'll go there. So I filled out my application and I started working various jobs. At one point during the summer before I left, I worked 3 jobs. I was super busy. I put every penny away and I was saving up because I absolutely knew I was going to go. So at the last minute, we were able to collect all the money, which was $3,000, which for the time was quite a bit of money. Compound that with the fact that we really didn't have a lot. My mom pitched in, my dad pitched in, and I remember coming up with $800 myself, which was quite a bit of money, but I was determined to go. And I will say that it absolutely changed my life. It was a pivotal point in my life because I ended up with a family called Arne and Synnøve Olas. And they had 2 daughters, Eva, who went on exchange to America, so I only knew her for a couple weeks before she left, and then Kina, or Christina. And the association that I've had with them over the last 35 years has been amazing, and can talk a little bit more about their sending their teenage kids to my house, and then my sending my teenage kids to their house for the summer over these past 8 years. And that has been a great experience for all the kids to be associated that way. Now, Arne and Synnøve were not LDS, and so they thought it quite strange that I would spend 6 hours every Sunday, an hour and a half traveling to the church, 3 hours in the church, and an hour and a half back home. But because my mother had taught me, and we had driven in Tennessee with the young kids, sometimes an hour each way to and from church, that's where you were on Sunday. You just went to church. And so nobody was there to force me. It would have been fine if I didn't go to church, but I just felt that that's where I needed to be. And so every Sunday I was there, and which really impacted me because helped to strengthen me, and also the example of my mother really made a difference. So going on exchange to Sweden helped me see a little bit higher standard of living, much higher actually than what I had been living in, and also helped me understand that the world was vast and there was a lot more out there and a lot more opportunities than I had opened myself up to. And so I started to think about my future and what I wanted to do with my life, and I concluded that whatever it was going to be something international, because I just absolutely loved being with the international. That was important to me. The other thing is that just before I left as a 16-year-old, and I left in 1982, excuse me, I was there 1981 to 1982 when I was 16. I put a list together of goals when I was 16 years old, and these goals included things like graduating from high school, graduating from college, going on this exchange, and then I felt very, very strongly that I was to go on a mission. And at that time, girls went on a mission at 21. Also, I was going to graduate from college, get my master's degree, buy a home, get married, all of these different goals that I had. And they were quite a few goals, but that was what I did right before I left for Sweden. Sweden, pros and cons in going, it took me a while. I struggled with the language, I struggled with the culture and with the food and living away from my family. But over time, it really, really helped me to be able to broaden my life and my experiences, and I was able to grow from that quite a bit. And so going to Sweden on exchange was one of the most pivotal decisions of my life. When I was 15, my parents divorced, and it was actually a relief because over the past 7 years, I had really felt that they were not happy together, and I kind of felt that their getting together and getting separating and getting back together was very, very difficult for us as children. My mom was wanting to make the marriage work and to get together and stay together for our eternal families, but my father was really, he would flip back and forth, and it wasn't until probably 40 years later that we found out that he was bipolar. And so sometimes he would be very happy and things were great, and other times he was just super depressed and didn't see how life was worth living. And so it was very, very difficult for my mother. When they did finally divorce, I think it was actually a relief for me because, okay, fine, let's get on with our life. My mother felt devastated because divorce was not the usual thing, especially within the LDS church. That was quite the stigma. And then my father, I think he finally realized what had happened and what he had kind of forced my mother into is that he felt very lonely. He was living in Salt Lake. We were up in Logan, Utah, and he didn't see us very often. And so very, very isolated and alone and sad, which was something, you know, he pushed for that divorce, but I think he didn't understand the ramifications of what it would actually mean to him. And so my mother had to work very hard for us. She would often give blood so that we could, or plasma, so that we could have the extra $10 just to be able to have food on the table. Even growing up when I was younger, even when my parents were married, we didn't have a lot. And it was mostly, even though my father had his master's degree, is because he changed jobs a lot. He didn't want to stay anywhere. Even when he had very, very good job, he just got those itchy feet and wanted to move. And it was part of the bipolar that he experienced. And so, you know, growing up, we didn't have a lot. I remember thinking when my kids, you know, when I have kids, I'm going to buy them underwear and socks without holes. And I wanted to eat meat more than just Sunday dinner. I mean, we had a chicken for Sunday dinner, and that was the big meal. Otherwise, it was a lot of fruits and vegetables, and my mom made homemade bread, which I still love to this day, but it wasn't extravagant meals. It was very, very humble meals. And that was something that instilled in me just the desire to be able to provide well for my children, and something that really drove me later in life to work hard and have a career and be able to provide for my kids, because I said I will never be poor again, just because we struggled so much as a family, and I know that it was so difficult for my mother. Later, my mom remarried. She married Rex Birch, who was very good to her. They ended up moving to Northern California, which after I came back from Sweden, that's where I spent my senior year in high school. I went to San Ramon High School, and we lived in that Northern California area. And just, it was a pretty good experience. We had about 10 of us that were active LDS kids that were in this school and did a lot together and had a very cohesive group, although I've always kind of felt as an outsider. I was always a little bit different from most people, and somewhat of a loner, not intentionally, but just because I like to do a lot of things on my own and can't always expect or anticipate other people to be there and do the things that I want to do when I want to do them. My father, as I mentioned, was later diagnosed with bipolarity. He did marry Diane, and she had 2 boys, Eddie and Brandon, who were my stepbrothers. When I went to college, I lived with them in Salt Lake City. Very, very wonderful lady. They ended up divorcing several years later, once again because my father just, you know, was always trying to find happiness and trying to look to the next thing to make him happy. He did settle down work-wise, though, once they got divorced. My parents got divorced, because then he had to provide this child support every month. And so he realized he had to have a steady income. He couldn't just take the family off camping and live in a tent, you know, with all of us, or do whatever kind of crazy adventure he wanted to come up with. And so that kind of settled him down in some ways, although it was a very lonely time for him. And later in life, he really struggled, even to the end of his life. He struggled with that, although he was able to get some help with medication. And later we kind of realized that his mother, Arlene Dean, also had struggled with the depression all her life. But once again, she wasn't diagnosed with it. That's just not something that was normal or talked about or even up on doctors' radars. After I graduated from San Ramon High School in 1983, I went to the University of Utah, and I lived with my father and stepmother Diane in the Sugar House area, Parley's area, and so I was only about 5 to 10 minute drive from the University of Utah. That was actually the only school I applied to, and didn't really have access to scholarships or understanding how to apply. My parents didn't help me with it, just kind of threw it out there, and that's where I decided to go. But I started there, and it was a pretty big adventure for me, and I really came into my own there. I settled in with Parley's 7th Ward Singles Ward, and as an 18-year-old, I did not realize that there were so many unmarried LDS people, because I thought, you know, in life you get married and then you have kids and you carry on. But our ward was filled with people, you know, 30 all the way up to 60 that were not married, which kind of just shocked me. I had no idea that there were so many unmarried LDS people. So as an 18-year-old, I definitely thought that the 30-year-olds were ancient, but we had a really, really great camaraderie there. I met one of my good friends, Joanne Worledge, there. She's still my friend to this day. And a lot of people, another person is Chuck Higgins, who actually later in life I hired his son to be one of my employees at the trucking company. So life goes around and we all come back together, but it was a good time. It helped to anchor me to the church and really helped me to stay connected and to have a family, because my mom and stepdad Rex were living in St. George at the time, and my father was not active at all. He was actually kind of anti-LDS and just didn't want anything to do with the church. So that helped me, sustain me through my 3.5 years at college. I went 2 summers in college just because I wanted to get through. I took full loads. I was working part-time nights at Key Bank as a proof operator, which worked for me because we would come in the afternoons and stay to the early evening, so from maybe 3 to 9 o'clock, just depending on the workload. And that's how I learned to do 10 key, and it was a very, very good job, paid well for my time during college. And so that was very nice to have some money, because I was paying for all of my schooling. My dad paid for my room and board, but as far as gas, and even my grandpa Dean had given me an old Fiat. They took off for a mission, and they had this old Fiat that had a glass pack muffler, so you could hear me coming for a 1/4 of a mile. And I was almost dumping a quart of oil into it every week just because of the leak that it had in the oil. And I really did not have a lot of disposable income, because all of the money went to pay for tuition and books, which at this time, you know, I kind of laugh, because when my oldest went to college, the cost of 1 year of college for her was basically the equivalent of my 4 years of schooling. So college costs have skyrocketed significantly since my going to college. The U was the right place for me. All of my friends went to BYU, but I knew that my rebellious nature was such that if I had rules and people told me that I had to do something, I was probably going to break those rules. Now, if they didn't tell me about the rules, then I would have kept the rules anyway, because that's my standards. But I just knew I was not one of those kind of people that could be so constrained and have every little detail laid out and told how to do things. That's not the way I was raised. I had a lot of latitude, because my mother would go to church with the kids on Sunday, my father would stay home, and we as kids knew we could choose whichever way we wanted to be. And so I usually chose to go to church because that's where I wanted to be. And so that's very much my nature. It's always been that way, that I want to choose. So I went to the University of Utah, right school for me, good size, met a lot of people, and as I was going to the university, I did not know what I wanted to study, no idea. And so I just started fulfilling my the core requirements, taking different classes in history and biology and political science, and that's where I ended up, is political science. I absolutely loved it, with an international relations certificate, all that international that once again come back around to when I had been an exchange student, something international. Now, I didn't know what I wanted to do with that degree. I just knew that I wanted to be involved somehow internationally. I did not want to go to law school, although later in taking the test for my master's degree, I actually scored like 98% in the logical category. So very logical. I love puzzles, love figuring things out mentally. So maybe I would have been a good lawyer, but I also could have hated it, because I know a lot of friends who went that way and don't really enjoy it. So graduated magna cum laude from the University of Utah in 1986, December of that year. So it took me 3.5 years. Like I said, I went full bore really fast, as just intense, because I would take as many hours as I could, because you had a break. You know, the amount of tuition was the same price for 12 hours or 16 hours, and I always wanted to maximize my money, so I would usually take those 16 hours whenever I could make it happen. One of the most fun experiences that I had while I was at college was in 1985. I actually got a scholarship to attend Uppsala University in Sweden. So I was able to go back to Sweden for 2 months in the summer of 1985, study with all these other foreign students from around the world, and be able to get involved in Swedish culture again. I got to see my Swedish family, my Swedish friend Sanna Öqvist, who even to this day we're still close. And to be able to reconnect with Sweden. What was so funny is that when I first went to Sweden, I could not stand the food. I did not like the hard bread. It was difficult language for me, and all of those cultural things. It was so shocking to me. And yet going back the second time was like going home. I loved the food, I loved the people, I loved being able to speak this foreign language and just to be able to have a whole new experience and love for the country. So that was a wonderful experience. And then after those 2 months, that third month, I Eurailed around Europe, and I did it by myself as I think I was 20 years old. And looking back, I'm like, I was crazy. Who in the world goes as a 20-year-old around Europe on the trains, sleeping on the trains a lot of the times, and not think about their safety a little bit more? And so it was amazing. Along the way throughout Europe, I stayed at some of the people's houses who had been at the camp with me. I stayed with Jan in the Netherlands, in Rotterdam. I stayed with another girl and her sister in Paris, outside Paris. And then I traveled for a little bit with two people that were at the school that came from Texas. We traveled for about a week together. Also stayed down in Irland with someone I had met. And so traveled around to different places, but a lot of times I was on my own. I was meeting up with different Americans as I would travel, but still, once again, on my own, staying at youth hostels. And what the funny part was that I averaged $10 per day. That was my spend. Some days a little more, some days a little less, but I would try to spend the night on the train about every other night. So I would pull into a place and spend the day there looking around, spend the night there at the youth hostel, and then once again spend the next day in the city, and then take a night train to a greater distance so I could get some sleep on the train. Crazy, crazy time, wonderful experience. Once again, check it off my bucket list because I had wanted to go and travel around Europe. I had other friends who expressed an interest in doing it, but when it came down to it, they didn't have the funds or the time or whatever, and I just thought, I'm not going to let them hold me back. I am going to make this happen and do it. And I've always been grateful that I had the desire and to follow through on one of my goals. That was really important to me. I graduated from the University of Utah December 1986, and in January 1987, I entered the mission field. Prior to that, as I had mentioned, my father was very anti-LDS, and in my last quarter at the U, I turned in my mission papers, and when I told him, he was so upset with me that he actually kicked me out of the house, and I went to live at my grandparents' house to finish out my last quarter. I think he has a tendency to want to control, and he probably thought that by doing this that he was expressing his displeasure, and he would make it very difficult for me to have the funding or whatever that I needed to go on my mission. But I stayed with my grandparents and I still made it happen. And so very interesting that that kind of, not so much a rift, but just him kicking me out, and then years later having him live with me at my house in my basement apartment for 15 years, the last 15 years of his life, was kind of ironic in that we had come once again full circle back around, because our relationship had been fairly tenuous throughout my life. I just didn't feel like he was very involved, and sometimes it was probably the bipolarity. He wasn't emotionally connected to many people. He had a hard time connecting with pretty much anybody in the family, and so it just difficult times with my father. But that was kind of the precursor to going on my mission. I graduated in that December. I had about 2 weeks of break, and then I was in the mission field about the 6th or 7th of January, and started off there. So I was in the Provo MTC for 9 weeks, and I remember every one of them, because in the beginning it was great, and by the end of those 9 weeks I was so sick of the cafeteria food and so sick of having to be with somebody all the time and being very, very restricted, which I did not enjoy. And also some of the teachers were very provincial. They're very LDS male, this is the way it will be, and don't dare walk across the room without somebody being there with you. Just very controlling, I felt. And so I was very much looking forward to being out in the mission field and being able to have a bit of freedom so that I could make some decisions. Going on my mission, I had wanted to go to someplace like Hong Kong, or someplace where I either had to, like Latin America, where I could use a machete to get to my investigator's house, or I could learn another language. And so when I got called to Sweden, in many ways I was disappointed. I wanted to discover more of the world. However, when I went back to Sweden, it was amazing. Once again, it was like going home. My Swedish mother, Synnöve, and my sister, Kina, met me at the airport as I flew in, much to the chagrin of my mission president, who was older. His name was Johnson, and he was very much old school. You know, you do this, you do that, you don't do this. And he was just aghast that there would be anybody at the airport that would meet this missionary. And so we just said hi. That was all we could do. And then I got whisked away to the mission home and then spent a night there. And then the next day I was off to Jönköping. I spent 7 months in Jönköping. And then the final second part of my mission, 9 months, was in the Stockholm area, which was wonderful because, once again, I was in the area that I had was familiar with, and I was able to go and see my Swedish family often. Per the new mission president, who was Max Kimball, and his wife Debbie, I was able to interact more with non-members, which is great. That's the way it should be. You know, as missionaries, we want to interact with people as much as we can. And so those first 7 months, my first 4 months of the 7 down in Jönköping, my companion was Sister Voutilainen, and she was from Finland. She was a convert, and she was a little bit older. She was 25. I was 21, and it was good in some ways. She was very friendly, very outgoing, but some things I felt that should be done a certain way. But it was a good companionship. She taught me many things and how to be a great missionary. And I also got her to run for 30 minutes every morning, and would not allow her to sizzla, which means you take brownies hot out of the oven and put milk over them every night. We could do it only once on Sundays. And so she actually ended up losing 10 pounds her last 4 months of her mission, which made her very happy. So good learning experience for me. As a younger person, I realized I thought a lot in black and white, not a lot of gray. And as I got older and had more experiences, I have been able to see, you know, there is a lot of gray in things, because as we experience things, we begin to understand other people's point of view and allow them a little bit of slack in the way that they do things. But as an early missionary, I was very black and white, which, you know, I'm sure was difficult for Sister Voutilainen, for me, the way I did things. I then had a Swedish missionary, Sister Holmgren, for 2 months, who was my second companion. She was the senior companion, and that was very difficult because she was often depressed, and she didn't work as hard, and she wanted to go home, quite frankly. And I didn't have much patience for her because I thought we were here to work and let's go. My third companion was Sister Michelle Blomqvist, who was from Salt Lake City, and I was the trainer, which is a little bit scary. I hadn't been out, you know, for very long, but I was the trainer. And I was only with her for 1 month, but it was amazing. Absolutely loved it. We had a lot in common. We'd go out and run. And ironically enough, we would run and we would say, we're never getting married and we're never going to BYU. Well, the funny part was, within a year of coming home from my mission, I got married. And then not too long after she got her undergrad degree from the U, she ended up going to BYU for her law degree. So ironic how these things we say and then turns out differently. On my mission, I interacted with a lot of people. I got to know and really feel for their welfare. I got to understand the interactions and the way Heavenly Father feels about His children. I also just once again had a huge change of heart, and my testimony grew so greatly. And just my love for Heavenly Father and my ability to receive inspiration and to be able to connect and feel just the love that Heavenly Father had. That mission set me up for the foundation for my testimony and my activity in the church for the rest of my life. And one of the reasons why I chose to go on a mission was that as a teenager, I would see these women in the church, and I would see a difference between those who went and those who didn't. And those who had gone on the mission, they knew their scriptures. They had a confidence about their ability to make decisions, and their testimony was huge. And there wasn't a lot of those women at the time. That was very unusual for a woman to go on a mission back when I was younger, and not very usual when I went on a mission. Usually it was the women who didn't get married or whatever, but that was my plan. I was going to graduate and go on a mission, and I wasn't having anything else about it. So going on a mission, once again, very pivotal for me, made a huge difference in my life. and just got a lot of experiences that I needed. When I moved to Stockholm, I had a mission companion who was Swedish. Her name was Sister Christiansen, and she was very outgoing and a little bit crazy, and I sort of had to curb her quite a bit because she was a little bit off the wall. She had converted just a couple years earlier and didn't quite understand how maybe a missionary should act, and so quite the opposites there. We were together 4 months, and then I had Sister Price for 2 months. I was her greenie trainer, and then I had Sister McFarland, who was with me for I think 4 months, and she sent me home. And I guess towards the end I was feeling a little bit trunky, but I was we absolutely had a great time. I think in those last 6 months of my mission, I baptized 6 people, and with Sister McFarland, I think there were 4, because we were just both committed to the gospel. She has recent convert, and just her story about her life was amazing. How she had overcome a lot of difficult circumstances and where she was, and so she was very strong in her testimony. And so these women that I was companions with, great experiences, always learning experiences, and I had baptized 3 people earlier, so baptizing 9 people in Sweden was amazing. And I didn't think much of it until I was about ready to go home, and the mission president happened to mention to Sister McFarland that he was really sad that he was losing his top baptizer. And I guess that was me. So I just really felt Heavenly Father's hand in my life as I tried to be obedient, especially those very last few months. I absolutely was 100% obedient. Obedience is a little bit hard for me. I feel like sometimes I know better, but I decided to follow all the rules, all the mission rules exactly, whether or not I agreed with them or not, and it made a huge difference in my success. And so that is one of the keys, I think, to strength in receiving impressions and help from Heavenly Father, is being 100% obedient. In July 1988, I came home from my mission. I then promptly spent the next month in my parents' basement because I was very afraid to go out on my own. Having been a missionary and with somebody for so long, it was really funny. I would go out early in the morning and run, and then I'd come home and kind of isolate myself. It was a little bit difficult for me to get back involved with life, but eventually I did. I had already graduated from school, and so I needed to find a profession, a career, something I could go into. And I looked at various jobs that were available, once again, through the newspaper. We did not have online. And I applied different places, but once again, I really wanted to go down that international route. And so before I had graduated as a poli-sci major, I had interned at the state of Utah in the International Economic Development Office for the state of Utah. And so I went to talk to them. I said, hey, are there any jobs opening? I really like to work here. And the secretary was retiring. And I did not want to be a secretary. There was no way. But I really felt strongly that that's where I needed to be. And so I signed on there full time, and I was making, I think it was $19,000 a year, which is not very much at all, especially with a degree, but I really felt that that's where I needed to be. So I was there for the course of the next 3 years, and rose up, advanced in my career, and was so funny because I had been there for maybe 3-4 weeks, if even that long, and I was just getting everything done so very quickly that one of the other ladies that was in our office happened to mention to the boss, I wonder what the other lady used to do, because Lark gets everything done in half the time, and what did this other lady do with her time? But I was very efficient. That was me, just getting things done, and so I would take on more and more and more responsibilities, so that over time I was able to move up within the state of Utah. So some of the things that I got to do a little bit later that were more exciting to me was escorting international visitors around, international dignitaries that would come to the state. We were responsible for promoting trade. Eventually I got to go to Taiwan to do a trade show over there. I escorted the vice governor, lieutenant governor, which was kind of funny because he was older than me, much more experienced, and then I was the one meeting him at the plane, taking him different places. It was kind of funny. And got to do different things with the international people, and that to me was really exciting. And so during this time period, I also went back to the University of Utah and lived in student housing, and I was getting my master's degree in economics, which took me about 2 years because I was going about part-time, and I was able to incorporate a lot of the things that I was doing at work, the studies that I was doing, and transfer over them into my master's projects, which I use. So that was very interesting. Once again, emphasis on international economics. All of that economics and politics just really interested me. I like to see how a country would evolve and what their economic situation would be with regards to their political situation, and how they correlated and all of that. So great time while I was there. At about 3 years in, my former boss, who had promised me that once I graduated with my master's, I could become one of the trade specialists and really, be able to make some good money, he was switched over to the tourism department, and we got another boss kind of as an interim boss. And I had graduated, and there were 2 trade positions that were open, and rather than promoting me and putting me in there, he hired these 2 white males, which, was very devastating to me. And about 1 month after he did this, he pulled me into the office with Franz Kolb, who was the European trade person that they had hired. And he said, Lark, Franz is having a difficult time. He needs an assistant and wondering if you could do it. Now, keep in mind that I was the protocol specialist. I was helping people with the dignitaries. I had just finished up handling a 700-person economic development council with the with Taiwan, and so I was quite full of myself and thinking, yeah, this is bull. And so I told him that I wasn't anybody's assistant and I should have been hired for Franz's job in the first place. Well, what happened is very telling in the society at the time, and especially in Mormon society. I had him tell me that I was a woman and he couldn't afford to put the time and energy in me because in 3 years I would be gone staying at home with my little kids, etc., etc. And that was very upsetting to me. And I kind of sat on it and stewed on it for several months. And I didn't do anything about it. But I couldn't sleep at night. On Sunday evenings, I hated to go back to work on Monday. I could tell that I was never going to get anywhere, progressed in that career. And so at that time, he had upset one of the secretaries that was in the office. She was my friend Jenny. And it really made me mad because I thought, he's very caustic. I can take it, but she can't. And that's when I went to Human Resources. They did an investigation, slapped his hand. He had to apologize to me, but I was quite certain that he would never change, and I was going to leave. So then I went over to a company. I left the state of Utah. I went into sales, which to me, sales sounded like a dirty word, the used car salesman. But I went into logistics, which is transportation, small package, a company called Airborne, which was a competitor to UPS and FedEx. And I thrived from day one. I absolutely loved it. Wasn't great at sales in the beginning, but I absolutely loved it, and I learned, and it was very challenging to me. I made it a game. And logistics is always changing. There's always something going wrong, and especially when I went into international logistics, that was different customers, different products, different rules, regulations, all of that. And so it was very, very stimulating for me, and I began to understand my father a little bit more and began to realize that he also needed that kind of stimulation to be excited about going to work. And so over the course of the next 24 years, I thrived in sales in the logistics field and was able to do quite well there. I returned from my mission in 1988, and within a few months of going to the Parley's Singles Ward, I met Miguel Maximo. He was actually half Portuguese from his father's side and half Chinese from his mother's side. His father was a dignitary, had lived different places around the world. Miguel had been born in different places and had traveled and was currently living in Utah, working a bit, and had been going to school. And I met him at a family home evening, and across the room I just felt this strong, strong attraction towards him, like pull together. And I thought, wow, that's kind of shocking. It kind of scared me, but we dated for a bit and didn't really get serious because he was actually contemplating moving out of state, maybe to Southern California, a different spot. And so I was just thinking, yeah, well, you know, that kind of made it safe for us to date and not make any big commitments. Well, right at the very last minute when he was getting ready to move, some things changed with arrangements on the other end, and he ended up staying, which was a little bit awkward because I was like, oh no, now we kind of, where are we in this relationship? Well, by November of that same year, we were really feeling like anxious and wanting to spend more time with each other, and then by December we were engaged. And interesting, exciting time in life. My father was not too keen on my getting married. I mean, I was 24, but once again, that tendency to control came up. And when I told him that we were engaged, he turned his back to me and kind of just poked the poker in the fire and didn't want to talk to me. But I could tell before he turned away from me that he was thinking, is there any way I have control over her and what I can do? And when I'd come home from my mission, I made sure that I moved out, got my own apartment, got my own vehicle that he was not a co-signer on, and was completely separate so that he could have no control over me in any way. And he didn't have any control over me. He couldn't say anything, so I just went out and we got married June 16th, 1989 is when we did. And I'd been working at Airborne at the time in sales. Excuse me, I actually got married when I was working for State of Utah, but then we were transferred over to Airborne, and I was there for about a year and a half and got a new boss, and he was a complete idiot, and I just thought, hey, I need to make a change here, whether I leave this company or whether I move and go into international. We need to make a change. And so Miguel was keen to do that. He was willing to move. And so I got in touch with the person, the regional sales manager for the international side. And I had a person that I knew who was a strong promoter of me and, you know, really put forth my resume. And was able to move to the San Francisco Bay Area. We lived in Burlingame, and I was there, we were there for 4 years during that time. And also during that time, Miguel was able to graduate from college, kicking and screaming. I kind of had to push him along through there. And at one point I told him, you know, hey, I can see this is not for you. Why don't you just start a business and forget about college? As soon as I said that, funny enough, he decided that yes, he wanted to finish, so he did. He went to apply for United Airlines as a flight attendant and speaking Portuguese. That was, you know, great for him. He went through their school and was hired to fly their New York to Brazil route, but we lived in California in the Bay Area, so he would hop a flight from San Francisco into New York and then fly his route down south. And so interesting time. Like I said, we were there for 4 years, and it was very isolated and lonely for me a lot of the times that last couple years when he was away doing that, because I would come home from work and he wasn't there. I didn't have a lot of friends that I'd hang out with, and so really felt isolated, and he was gone a lot. During that time period, we had been experiencing infertility, which was very difficult because I wanted to be pregnant very, very badly, wanted to start a family, and yet it just wasn't coming. And I would pray and ask Heavenly Father, and he would flat out tell me no. Well, that was frustrating because I didn't understand why. Why would wanting this worthy goal, why wouldn't it happen? Well, it wasn't until 3 years later at the end of this infertility that I began to understand. During about October 1995, I was pregnant, and I was very, very excited. We had tried for a long time, and Miguel came home from one of his flights, and I sat him down. I said, I'm so excited. I just want to tell you that I am finally pregnant. And I thought that he would be super excited, but he wasn't. He basically said, well, I don't want to be a father, and I don't want to be married to you anymore, which was completely out of the blue. I had no idea where this came from. Completely shocked me. I mean, when we were together, we would go on dates, we were reading the scriptures together every day, we were having personal and couples prayer together, we would go to the temple every month, we would go to church all the time. And over the course of our separation and eventual divorce, I began to realize that he had changed and gotten more active because of me. And over time, he just couldn't commit to that situation, and he was not happy. and that he was not happy being a member of the church or following those restrictions or even being married to me. And our personalities were quite different. And I have to think that I'm very wanting to accomplish goals and moving forward, and that intensity from me kind of just pushed him too much. It was just too much for him because he just wanted to sit back and have a good time. So in retrospect, I began to understand that the infertility was more to bless me, because then he wasn't connected with this child that would come. Because if he had been connected with her, I would have had to deal with him for the rest of my life. Well, he left me when I was 6 months pregnant, just disappeared. He had no cell phone. I had no way of getting in touch with him. He moved to the East Coast, and he was still doing his route on United. I had nothing. And so my daughter Sky was born June 22nd, 1996, and I pretty much had plans to go on maternity leave, and then I was not coming back I wasn't planning to go back, and so I packed everything up, and once she was 11 days, I moved back to back home to Salt Lake City. Now, Miguel did come in when she was 11 days old. He saw her. I think he was very proud of her and very touched. He and my stepdad drove the truck and the car back to Salt Lake City, and my mom had come in a month before Sky was born to be with me because I was all alone. I was terrified that I would go into labor at some point in the night and not be able to drive myself to the hospital. I was absolutely terrified and really didn't have anybody to rely on. It was a very tough and dark time for me, going through that 6 to 9 months of being pregnant and just feeling alone and isolated and like a cast off, and putting a happy smile on at work and for my family for the most part, because I didn't want them to harbor bad feelings about Miguel, because I still thought he was going to come back, that he was just off having a difficult time because his father had died earlier in the year and it was just difficult. But he didn't. He didn't come back. He did see Sky when she was 2 months old in Salt Lake City, and then since then I haven't seen him in 21 years. He did attempt to make contact with us about when Sky was about 3 years old through a mutual friend, but he wanted to come see her, and we said, yeah, sure, come on out, but he never did, and I pretty much figured that would be the way it is. So he continued to fly with United. He transferred down to Brazil. It turned out that he actually had a woman that he was seeing, another flight attendant, who had a child that's 2 months younger, 2 months younger than Sky. So this woman had contrived to pull him away and all of this stuff, and that was the right thing, that he needed to walk his way and I needed to walk mine, even though at the time it was extremely devastating and I was very, very depressed and just trying to make it through the day. I came to understand very closeness to Heavenly Father during this time had a lot to do with just praying and trying to understand what was going on, and Heavenly Father telling me that Sky was never meant for Miguel, that she was mine, she was a gift to me for personal righteousness, and that I just needed to stay close to Heavenly Father and to work things out. And so I moved back to Utah, did some things there, and eventually went back to working for Airborne out of Utah, doing an international job again. But normally that person's based in Denver, but they allowed me to be based in Salt Lake City. But I did travel to Denver quite a bit. So Sky was the light of my life. I had my mom and stepdad move into the house that I owned, that I had been renting out while I was in San Francisco, and just beautiful child, and really connected with her. What was so interesting is that when she was born, C-section, she was almost 10.5 pounds, big girl with lots of black hair. And my mother was there, as I mentioned, and I was shaking so badly after the C-section, just the after effects, that I couldn't really hold her, and so my mom was holding her. She was crying, and finally when my hands settled down enough that I could hold her, I put her in my hands, and we looked in each other's eyes, and Sky took a deep breath like this, and she just settled down and stopped crying, and I knew that she knew that I was her mother, and she felt safe, and it was amazing, just really amazing, that connection that we had. She's always been an old spirit. She helped me, even as a young child, through a lot of the grief and the difficult times that I had over the course of the years. And so I really appreciate her. She was a real big blessing for me in that time period. I call it, my darkest time. and being able to go through that. So when I was trying to get a divorce, there was a lot of things I had to do. I had moved back into Utah. Miguel wasn't responding. I had no way to get in touch with him. And then I had to stay and be at a residence in order to file for divorce, which I eventually did. And by, I think it was early April or end of March 1998, 1997, that I was officially divorced, and had no contact with Miguel, had no way to get in touch with him. It was just very odd. He just disappeared. And so it was right around that time period that I found out through a letter that came to me from the healthcare provider that there was another child, and I called the doctor's office and tried to figure out all the things that were going on there, because at the time when I got the letter, I was still legally married to Miguel. And so that's how I found out about the other woman and the other child. And it was just such a difficult time. Every time I thought that my life couldn't possibly get more bizarre, it just continued to get stranger and stranger with this story with Miguel. And, you know, in retrospect, if you just kind of talked to me and put it all on the table, I probably wouldn't have liked it, but at least it would have been done. So I moved to Utah, and I had this vision in my mind. I knew that I needed to be married and that I needed to have a father for my child. And so once I was officially divorced, I was wondering how to go about doing this, and I got the prompting that I needed to put an ad in the newspaper classifieds. Once again, there was no internet, there was no, you know, put your profile online. That did not exist. Now, if it had been any other city except Salt Lake, there was no way I would have done that. I even was appalled at even thinking about putting an ad in the paper, but that's what I felt prompted to do, and so I did it. So I put an ad in the newspaper, explained who I was, divorced with a child, that I was very active LDS, professional, well-educated, all of these things, and I got a response. My very first response was from Stephen Galley, and he was from New Orleans, and I had moved there a few years earlier, had joined the church. He had been married before to a Utah woman, and then she wanted to separate, came to Utah, and then he felt that he had made a commitment in his marriage, and so he left his job, got a job as an environmental engineer in Utah. That was his background, and did everything he could to try to put the marriage together, and she just wasn't having it. So having converted, he decided it would be better for him to stay in Salt Lake City than to try to, you know, resume life in New Orleans, where he didn't have a lot of support in the church there. Interesting thing is, we were living within 2 miles of each other, but we never would have met each other if I had not placed that ad. And he had been looking to date different people by looking in the classifieds, because he couldn't date a client, he couldn't date a coworker, and he didn't really know anyone else, and so it was difficult for him to find people to date, and so that's why he had done it. And so we started going out. A few other men answered my ad as well, and I would go out with them and just date a few different people. And so it narrowed down, and by June I knew that Stephen was the one, and by July we started talking about marriage, and by August 8th, 1997, we were married, and Sky was 14 months at that time. He has been the only father that she has ever known, and he took her in and loved her as his own from the very, very beginning, and that was really important to me, that I could tell that he loved and cared about her before we ever got married. And then a year later, he was able to adopt her, fully adopt her, which I heard through the grapevine that Miguel was not happy about, but he was not involved in her life at all. And as I remembered what I'd been prompted about earlier when I was pregnant with Sky, that she was never meant for Miguel, that she was meant for our family separately to that. So Stephen and I were married in the Salt Lake Temple, but because my sealings had not been canceled all the way, we actually had to wait a year until we were able to get sealed, and we did that in the Jordan River Temple. And so we've had different struggles over our marriage. We are both very headstrong and fiery personalities, but I think in retrospect, the experiences that each of us had to go through in being married and having our spouse leave us because we were both very intense, and being humbled and just being guided, I really see Heavenly Father's hand in what happened with my coming from San Francisco to Salt Lake, with Stephen's coming from New Orleans to Salt Lake, living so close within proximity of each other, and then connecting at just the right time. I can finally see Heavenly Father's hand in that. And through that whole experience, I came to really rely on Heavenly Father, and I began to trust Him more than I ever had before, because of just the depths of my sorrow and the depths of the difficulty that I'd gone through, and how He was able to protect and guide me. I began to trust Him, and throughout life, as difficult things have come up, that trust has never wavered. I've absolutely always known that things will work out for the best. Difficulties with children might arrive, difficulties with finances or in marriage or whatever, but I'm absolutely 100% trusting in Heavenly Father, and I know that He will make it all right. Stephen and I built a house in South Jordan, Utah, which we moved into when Sky was just about 2 years old, and that was, I want to say, April 1998. And we had built this house. We were not very good at that. We probably should have hired a professional. So within just a few months, I was thinking, wow, you know, I would have done this better, and I wish this or that. But nice house, nice area, very undeveloped. We're at 112th South. Relatively near the freeway, 106th South exit at about 10th West, right in there. But beautiful homes, and a lot of it undeveloped, and so over the course of the next 10 years, more and more homes were built in that area. And a very great neighborhood. We moved in there. Ours was one of the less expensive houses, and really thinking that these people were rich and they were just going to be, you know, snubbing us and all of that. And I have to say, I never experienced that. These were wonderful people, and the quickest to serve and to help other people, more so than I have ever seen in my life. And it's been a great area. Because of all my moving around, I really wanted to help with the stability of my family, and Stephen even more so, because he pretty much grew up in the same house his whole life. And so we committed to moving into that neighborhood and being there until our kids graduated from high school. Well, right now our youngest, Victoria, is turning 17 next month in November, and she has one more year as a senior there. And so we have been in the neighborhood the whole time. We've not been in the same house. We lived in that first house that we built for 2 years, and then we moved up the street to a actually bigger, nicer house that I was very much set on, and Stephen just had to roll his eyes in the back of his head, because whenever I feel like I want something, I will find a way to go out and get it, whether it's for the best or not, but sometimes I just get that intensity. And so we've been in the neighborhood, absolutely love it. Good people, they've blessed our lives, and they've blessed the lives of our children, for which we're very, very grateful for. During that time period, when we were at the other house, the first house that we built, we had a son, Christian Dean Galley, who was born October 21st, 1999. And then a year later, we had Victoria Kathleen Galley, born on the 16th of November, the year 2000. And Stephen's mother was still living in New Orleans. His father had passed away when Stephen was in his early 20s. So we would go back and forth once or twice a year, take the kids with us, and Granny would come up and see us, and just wonderful mother-in-law. We were very close, and she loved Sky just like her own. Didn't matter that she was adopted, just loved Sky, loved Christian, loved Victoria. And whenever she'd come up to our house, she had to sleep in each of their beds, so she would do a round robin with them in their little twin beds. And you can imagine sleeping with the kid when you're in your late 50s and 60s. It wasn't always restful, but she absolutely adored the children, and she was very, very good to them and to me as well. She later got esophageal cancer and died at 67. She'd been sick for a while, and it was very, very difficult for all of us, and I miss her now. That was a hard time. We moved up the street, as I mentioned, when Victoria was about 6 months old, a bigger home. We had live-in nannies with us because I was working full-time. I had transferred from Airborne over to Expeditors, and I was a global sales executive, had a very high-powered job, huge responsibilities. I was dealing with a big customer called iOmega, traveling around the world, doing all those things that I wanted to do, and yet, you know, with these young children, it was very difficult. Because when Christian was 4 months old, I had to get on a plane and go to Malaysia. And I was still nursing. I was not excited to leave him. I was quite upset, and it was emotionally disturbing to me. But switched then from global after Victoria was born, and I went into sales, just local sales in Utah, so I didn't have to travel out of state, and that was much better. I enjoyed it. I had realized that even though being a global sales executive, the title was fancy, I got a bit more money, I got to travel and all these things, I was more operational role, which was not me. And going back into sales, seeing different companies, meeting different people, the dynamics of it all, that was where I really thrived, and I enjoyed it. And over the course of the next several years, I did very well. My base was very small. 80% of my take-home pay was my commission, and I actually earned multiple six-figure income because of just the companies that I had brought on and things that had happened, and the accounts that I was able to close, and just had a really good time doing that. But at the same time, it came to a head that I just realized I couldn't continue on being the mother of these small children and wife and helping out and still trying to put in 10, 12-hour days at work, and it didn't seem that no matter what I did, it just wasn't enough for this big Fortune 500 company. And so at some point when they had my annual review and they said, hey, you're just not doing well enough, and I'm like, I did twice as much new business as everybody else in the region. What is it not good enough? And at that point, it was kind of the last straw. I had a new boss, and he was micromanaging me, and it was not working for me. Just do not like to be told what to do. And so I said, listen, you've asked me to kind of let you know if I wanted to leave, and I think I'm giving you 6 months notice. My kids get out of school at the end of June, so let's just call it a day at the end of that. And they almost died. They could not believe that I would ever leave that kind of income. It was 2011, January 2011, and people were just vying for jobs. You know, so many candidates for one job, and anybody would have killed for it, and yet here I was willing to walk away. But I really put my faith in Heavenly Father, and I knew that I needed to do this. And what's funny is that Stephen was very concerned, and he said, wow, I don't know how we're going to make it financially, et cetera, et cetera. And he said, what will happen if we can't make it? And I looked at him and I said, then we will sell the house. And at that point, he knew I was serious, because I loved our house. And it was very beautiful. It was one of the parade of homes. The architecture was amazing, but he knew I was all in and committed. Well, we didn't sell the house, but we did live off the stock for the next year. I became a consultant, and I was able to get out and work just half the time that I had been working at Expeditors, and yet over the course of the next year, I was able to build up my clients and bring in a good income from that, and be able to progress and finally achieve what I wanted to do, is be able to have flexible time, be able to be with my kids, because I hadn't been able to go to their midday school activities or their award ceremonies or their little skits that they plays that they have it during the middle of the day, because I was so busy with all of the other things that I had to do. And so it was a big life change for me, but it was something I was committed to. I left corporate America 2011 when my oldest daughter Sky was right around 15, and that was big for her, because she was like, you were never here before and now you're here all the time. And I just felt the importance of that a parent needs to be there for the kids as they're getting in that age right after school, because from 3 to 6, when the parents aren't there, that's a critical time for children. And so I made that commitment for her, and then as the other kids were growing up, I was there as well. And it's been really nice to be able to be flexible, to be able to assist them with the things they want to do and help them, and yet still have a very fulfilling career, and just fulfill me in many ways. I feel like I have a very blessed life in being able to do the things that I would like to do and the flexibility that I have. In January 2014, I had been out on sales calls. It was the 15th of January, filling up my car in the middle of the day, and I got a call from my brother-in-law, James Bentley, who's married to my sister Emily. And he said, Lark, I need to tell you something. It's very difficult. Your father has been in an accident. He's here at the Intermountain Hospital in Murray, and I need you to come down because you are listed as having his power of attorney, his medical power of attorney, which was a shock to me. I didn't know this. My father had since divorced twice since my mother, so he'd been divorced 3 times, and I guess he felt like I was the one he needed on that medical power of attorney. So I went down to the hospital and pretty much in shock and learned what had happened. It was completely devastating to us. In November, he had had knee surgery, and he was struggling to get back walking and to deal with that. He had had different medication. His bipolarity medication had been changed, and it takes a couple weeks to kick in, and then the medication that he was getting for the pain and some other things was not allowing him to sleep, and so he was going through this sleep deprivation, etc. And because of that, we feel that he probably nodded off when he was driving. He crashed into a parked street sweeper off the side of the freeway and was kind of banged up, and the street sweeper jumped out of the car, ran to see him, and my father was shouting, and he actually pulled out a gun and shot himself, killed himself. I think the accident was just like the last straw. He was just done. It was very difficult for our family. Suicide is very, very difficult because in the last almost 4 years since he has passed away, the hard part is you look at this situation and you say, couldn't I have done something to help you? Or the pain that he must have been experiencing that was so difficult, the only way he felt that he could overcome this was to do away with himself. Suicide leaves a huge impact on the people that are left behind because of the questions that they have and the things that are left wanting. So it was a very, very difficult time. My father was not going to recover. The doctor pretty much said he's going to be eventual forever. He's on the ventilator, and as soon as we pull these machines, he's going to be done. Now, my father had actually had tattooed on his chest, DNR, do not resuscitate. And he was adamant that at some point when he eventually died, he did not, or was an accident or whatever, he was not going to be resuscitated. He did not want to be vegetable. And I think that he had this thoughts of death on his mind for a very, very long time. 10 years earlier, he had even mentioned about some things such that he had been living in my basement. My biggest concern with my father was that he was going to shoot himself in the basement and my kids would find it. That was one of my fears. And so the fact that he had actually done this was not shocking to me in any way. My dad can be very dramatic about it a lot of times, but it was just very, very sad. As having his medical power of attorney, I was the one who needed to decide what would happen and how I would follow his wishes, etc. My sister that's just younger than me, Emily, was completely grief-stricken. She would not have been able to make that decision. She actually abstained from being involved at all. My siblings who were in the area all gathered around my father's bed, and we talked about it, and then we decided to follow his wishes. Once again, my sister Emily just completely abstained. She and my sister Chrissy were hysterical. They were quite distraught. My brother Stephen was there, and then my sister Catalina was there. Kim lived out in Southern California, Southern Utah, so she didn't come up. And then my brother Paul was living in Missouri, so he wasn't there either. But they had all been informed via telephone what was going on. And so we made the decision, and I make decisions like that very dispassionately because to me it's what he wanted, and he would not have survived without the machines. And so I said, okay, pull the plug. They turned off everything. They didn't, so that when he did pass away, the moment it would not flatline and let all of us know. So we were in there, we spent some time there, and it was very upsetting to me, just very, very difficult for me. Like I said, I didn't feel like I was super close to my father, although in the last several months we had gotten closer and just had tried to help him as much as I could. That was difficult. And then on top of that, just the month prior, middle of December, because of my comments about helping him be more profitable and helping him find better insurance for his company, for his trucks. He had a small trucking company. I started talking to him about ways I could help him. He didn't have to pay me or anything. I was just going to give him some business advice and kind of coach him through some business strategies. He said, great, and he actually went off all on his own volition and put in writing that if anything happened to him, that I would get 51% of his business, and his operations manager, Steve Jensen, would get 49%. Well, he showed me the paper, he had it notarized, etc., and gave me a copy, and my dad always does just strange off-the-wall things. So I didn't think anything more of it. I'm like, that's great, Dad, whatever. He had done this prior twice with two different nephews, two different sons of my sister Emily, who had helped him at different times at the trucking company. So, one more thing, I didn't think anything of it. Well, because he had done that, then I took over his business. And that was interesting because over the course of the next several months, Emily became quite upset with me because she felt that she should have some controlling interest in the business and she should have some things, etc. But she had actually turned my father down when he had offered it to her several years earlier. But that caused a rift in our relationship, and she pretty much emotionally blackmailed me and said, hey, you either get me involved or I won't talk to you anymore. And I said, well, I can barely have a conversation with you, so I guess this is it. And 3 years later, we haven't talked, which, once again, she's very emotionally unstable, and so it's actually been better for me not to have to deal with the instability that has plagued my family. Over the course of that year, 2014, very, very difficult. I think I was like in a brain fog for those first 5 months. I don't even remember the first 5 months of 2014 because I was so distraught and overwhelmed with trying to figure out how to take on this new business, and also my siblings had nominated me as the executor of the estate. Once again, my sister Emily did not like that. She wanted to be the co-chair and get to veto what I decided. And I said, listen, I'm not married to this idea of being the executor. I can either do it or not, but I'm not going to do it with you looking over my shoulder telling me what to do. And so the rest of the kids were like, hey, let Lark do this. Great, fine. And so it was very difficult. I think my father, that the accident was just like the last straw. I think he had been thinking about doing away with himself for a while. And once I had offered to help him, he's like, great, I now have somebody to take over my business. I can kind of be done with life. And so that's where I think he was mentally. He had nothing written down as far as like how to run the business. I put together an SOP for everything with regards to the invoicing, with how things run. I started working with Steve Jensen, who was also a partner, and my dad was right. Without him, we pretty much couldn't have continued the business because he's there on site every day. And then I also had to take care of my father's personal side. He was in debt quite a bit. He did get life insurance money, which was written solely to me with the understanding that I would take care of his estate and then divide the rest for the family. Once again, my sister Emily, completely volatile, blew up at me several times in 2014, accused me of stealing, etc., etc. And I said, if I were going to steal, I could have legally kept that life insurance money. But I didn't. I did exactly what Dad wanted me to do, to the penny. I divided it up to the penny. And that was something that really hurt me in my integrity because I felt like I had always tried to do what was right and what my father would want me to do. The trucking company was in the red when I took it over. My father had a lot of trucks, a lot of assets. He was paying for things that he did not need to pay for. It was overextended as far as like too many assets. And so I right-sized it. I went to Goldman Sachs 10,000 Small Businesses course for 4 months, which was really intense, like MBA program, a short little mini course, which helped me to understand the cost side of finances and how I might grow the business if I wanted to do that, which I did attempt, and Steve did not want me to do that. He was content in his little bubble. He's used to being an employee, not an employer, and so it was kind of difficult over the first year to explain to him why, as owners, we need to do things in certain ways. But for the most part, our partnership has worked out. He takes care of the truck maintenance and the drivers and being on site, and then I do the soft side. I call it the soft side. I buy and sell trucks. I do the taxes. I handle the payroll and the regulations, anything that way, hiring, etc. So it's been interesting. My life has kind of taken a turn, but just very, very satisfying in many ways. Been able to accomplish a lot of things. And then in this last year, I've started putting together different trainings that I have, sales training on the things that I learned to become. I was actually the the #1 sales rep for Expeditors, who is a Fortune 500 company in 2005. Put together a lot of things that I learned, and just over the course of the time, other things, money management and body language, and different courses that I have with setting up your day, doing certain things to make sure your days are right and staying on task with your goals, and manifesting your goals. That's really important to me. And so putting together those courses, and just very, very satisfying. I'm about to launch that and get it out there for the world to see, I guess, and then learning different things about how to continue market and to just be able to earn money in a very creative way, and something that stimulates me, and yet something that I can do within the parameters that helps me enjoy time with my family. I travel a lot, travel with my husband, who travels a lot for both the military as well as for his job as an environmental engineer. He leaves tonight for Puerto Rico to deal with the aftermath of the hurricanes there. This is the Army job, and spending time with him. And then Sky just moved out about a month ago. She's 21, graduated from Westminster. Very proud for her. She has double major and has got a job. So that's been my goal in life, to be able to produce offspring that are contributing members to society. And she's, like I said, old spirit, very far beyond her years. And Christian is just turned 18, barely, and a senior in high school. He's getting ready to apply for various colleges. Will probably go into mechanical engineering. Had a bent for that since he was 6 years old, and put the dinosaur erector set together, and Daddy came along and screwed it up, and so he knows how to put things together. Very, very intricate mind. Will do great there. And then Victoria is on the cross-country running team at Bingham High School, and has one more year to go in high school, and we will see where she ends up with that. But very satisfying to have a family and to be able to experience many things in life and just learn. As I look back, I'm 52 years old. As I look back on my life, I began to understand that with time comes perspective. I think that's one of the greatest blessings, that we can understand why things happened, and to have more consideration, more leniency, more understanding and compassion for people in the experiences that they go through, so that we can begin to understand them and be able to be patient and loving. In the beginning of my early days, I was very, very driven. I still am driven, but it was with blinders on and not allowing people the time, consideration, or maybe patience that I should have. And now being able to help people, being able to take the time that I would like to serve and to bless others' lives, that's been really important to me. And I'm so grateful that I have the resources and the means to be able to do that. And just enjoy sharing my life with you. It's I call it my first century, and looking forward to another century. So life is great.